Let's open our Bibles tonight to 2 Samuel chapter 13. Just a quick overview to kind of get us historically where we are. Saul was a man that God had called to be king, and at some point God set him aside. Nearly 40 years of his life he had been king, but the Lord had David in mind. He told him when he was yet a youngster, a teenager, that he would be a man after God's own heart, that he would serve as a king. When Saul died, and David, after 7.5 years of running for his life, was brought into the government, but he was only really allowed by the people to rule over Judah, because in the north, Saul's family and his cousin Abner resisted David's oversight, wanted to make a way for Saul, who God had rejected. Finally, in 1004 BC, David, at 37 years old, was given the run of the place. He was made king over all of Israel. He took the Jebusites out of Jerusalem. He established his capital there. And then beginning in verse 6 in chapter 6 and chapter 7, David's first line of business was to get the people back to walk with God. They were, after all, God's people. They hadn't done that for many, many years. In fact, it had been, literally 400 years since Joshua died. And since then, they hadn't done very well. There was several hundred years of the judges. There was 40 years of Saul's reign. There were 6 decades of the prophet Samuel preaching the gospel. And yet the nation had not come back around to serve the Lord. David made that his first order of business. He was a man after God's own heart for sure. He, with some difficulty, returned the ark of the Lord, God's presence, into the national life. But seeing it sitting outside his palace under a tent, he felt bad. He thought, man, I should build the Lord a beautiful place to be worshiped. And he was told by the Lord through the prophet that God wouldn't want him to build that. He was a man of war. He had established the nation, that his son would be allowed to build it. But along with that refusal came God's promise to David that he would be in the lineage of the promised Messiah, that someone from his throne would not be, or I should say from his family, would always be on the throne forevermore. And it just blew David's mind. In fact, David, as a poet, songwriter, he was just flabbergasted. Oh man, that the Lord would do this for me. When we come to chapter 8, there is a report of David's major campaigns to reclaim the land. It had been overrun by so many enemies over the years, much of it because the people weren't walking with God. But through David's leadership and by that campaign, the kingdom of Israel spread and expanded to almost the places that, God would speak about to Abraham. Actually, it had a long way to go, but it was as close as it would have ever gotten and would ever get until the Lord comes. In chapter 9, David fulfills a promise made to Saul, his enemy, really, and his son Jonathan, his friend, to take care of his family. He took in one of Jonathan's sons. His name was Mephibosheth. He had been dropped at age 5 on his head. He had left him unable to walk, lame in both of his feet. In chapter 10, the Lord then continued to bless David. They took on the Syrians. They subjugated the Syrians to Israel. And then with all of that going on so well, David in power, God's blessing continuously, the kingdom expanding, you would expect in chapter 11 to go, well, that's just going to continue. But it doesn't. In fact, we run into a problem for David with a woman named Bathsheba. We spent a long time in chapter 11 talking about some of the things that we learned in the narrative that tells us why David had a problem. For one thing, he stayed home when everyone else was out sowing and serving and reaching out and fighting the battles against the Ammonites and Ammon. David was very idle. He was by this time 50 years old, and idleness is not ever good for you. You want to stay busy in serving the Lord. He had wandering eyes. He was a man that loved women. He married a lot of them. Was certainly one of his weaknesses, and in the midst of all of these good things, it was an area that David needed to address, and a lot of times he didn't. And we talked about how sin grows. First it was lust, then it was adultery, then it was deceit. Eventually it became premeditated murder, all schemes to cover David's sin. By the time you get to the end of chapter 11, you might think that David did a great thing. At least the people might have. He took a widow from her husband had been killed in battle, and he took her in for himself, married her, and then raised this child with her. The people probably applauded. Trust me, the Lord did not. Between chapter 11 and 12, well over a year passes. David has not repented. The baby has been born. God is silent outwardly, but the Holy Spirit was screaming in David's ear because he just doesn't leave us to be, in rebellion, if you will. The Lord said to him in Psalm 50, verse 21, "You did all of these things, and I kept silent. You thought that I was altogether like you, but I'm going to rebuke you, and I'm going to set these things in order before your eyes." And so for this year, David suffered tremendously. You can read a couple of the chapters that he wrote during that time, especially chapter 32 of Psalms, chapter 51 as well. And David will refer to the emotional trauma he's been going through. He couldn't sleep. He'd lost his vision. He wasn't seen very much in public. It would seem, from all indication, he was pretty sick physically because of the depression and the guilt and the trying to hide the thing. And it was a miserable year for David as his conscience convicted him, as the Holy Spirit leaned on him. I always remember that story about Jesus when those men brought that woman caught in the act of adultery. And then you read about Jesus writing in the dirt. And then you read in John, I think it's chapter 8, verse 9, that from the least, from the oldest to the youngest, convicted by their own conscience, they walked away. As Jesus just wrote, "Hey, remember last Tuesday over there, buddy? Remember what you did over there?" And, "Oh yeah, I got to go." It was the conscience that was just convicting them and making it difficult for them. So David had a horrible year. He wrote in Psalm 32 that his guilt was like cancer. It ate him up from the inside. He had to face the silent horror of his sin, of his lust, of his murder. Maybe even seeing his wife from time to time just in tears that she has lost the husband that she so loved. So guilt and conviction, they're not all recorded here in the historical books. You will find them in Psalm 32 and 51. And David disappears, from the limelight. He really isn't seen in public. It really was the reason a little later you'll find Absalom working the crowds, because David has been so out of touch that the people feel like he doesn't care anymore. And he said, "Well, I'd be available if I was in charge." So in between chapter 11 and 12, there is this struggle with the Holy Spirit in the heart of this sinful man, David, who knew the Lord, loved the Lord, did some really dumb things. And hiding his sin, fearing the wrath of God, because what he did, adultery and murder, those are both punishable by death according to the law. You didn't get out. There was no out. This was horrible, and it was dangerous for him. David had been prepared by the Lord for God's mercy. And in chapter 12, when the Lord sends Nathan the prophet to confront David, David is more than willing to confess. And he does. And the consequences of his sin, the Lord, first of all, says through Nathan, "You're not going to die. You're going to survive this." But then beginning in verse 8 of chapter 12 through about verse 12 of chapter 12, Nathan lays out specifically the fruit of his sin. Not that God didn't forgive him. He did, immediately. Repentance brings God's forgiveness. But there are consequences. And for David, these were pretty strong and pretty exacting. You despised the commandments of the Lord. You did evil in his sight. You took a man's wife. You had him killed. From now on, the sword isn't going to depart from your house. I'm going to raise up adversity against you from your own family. Your wives are going to be taken from before your eyes and laid in public with others. You did it in secret. I'm going to do this publicly so that all of Israel might fear the Lord. And I'm sure David just heard, "I'm not going to die." But there is this consequence that follows. Chapter 13, where we come to tonight, is really the end of, let me put it another way. When we get to chapter 20 of this book, the last 4 chapters are not in chronological order. They are like vignettes of different times in David's life. So the story stops in chapter 20 until we jump ahead to 1 Kings. But this is about as good as it got with David until now. The rest of these chapters lay out for us and for David the consequences of sin. So though he has this zenith in chapter 11, it's going well, chapter 10, I should say. It just kind of falls off the cliff from there. And though David will the Lord continue to use him. And certainly David at the end of his life is a godly man and we're going to see that in a couple of times when Absalom comes to overthrow him. We'll see David, a mature, godly man. A lot of this is tough to deal with because once you decide to head down the road of sin, it's hard to turn around, hard to come back. So tonight we'll chapter 13 and 14. It covers 7 of the last 20 years of David's life. He would die at 70 years old. These are the 7 years after his 50th birthday or so. It is horrible when sin bites you. It is worse when sin's consequences hurt those that you love. And maybe that's when you start to go, man, I can't do this any longer. And we quickly want to value the walk that we have of the Lord. And for David, his weakness was with women. He had a lot of marriages. His laxness was his parenting. Very rarely raised his voice against his children, didn't show much leadership in the home. I suspect a lot of it's because there were a lot of homes. How do you keep up with all this? Hard enough to keep one home together. David had tens of homes. And so you find David failing much of the time as a father, taking the easy kind of indulgent route, impulsive emotions, judgments without knowing the whole story, rarely disciplining everyone. He sounds a lot more like Eli in chapter 3 of 1 Samuel. He allowed his sons to sin with very little accountability or consequences. But at least after the sin with Bathsheba, the reason David was in that position was they were going to throw at him, hey, remember what you did. He was in no position to chastise anyone, right? He put himself in a place of powerlessness in many ways. David's transgression, his lustful life, his negligence as a father would lead to all of these troubles that the Lord prophesied through the prophet in chapter 12. There is a verse in Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 19, and this is what it says: your own wickedness will correct you, and your backsliding will rebuke you. In other words, a lot of the punishment for sin is built into the consequences of sin. The Lord doesn't need to do anything. You do it, and the consequences say, and you suffer the consequences. And so that's certainly the case in David's life. So a couple of sad chapters, but lots to learn so that we can avoid this position altogether. Verse 1 of chapter 13. I don't think I'm going to be able to review every chapter every week. After this, Absalom, the son of David, had a lovely sister. Her name was Tamar, and Ammon, a son of David, loved her. Ammon was so distressed over his sister Tamar that he became sick. She was a virgin. It was improper for Ammon to do anything to her. As we said, David had a lot of wives. You can see some of them listed in chapter 3 of this book, with a lady named Maacah, who was a pagan from Syria. He had a son named Absalom and a daughter named Tamar. With another woman named Anohim, a woman from Jezreel, David had a son named Ammon. He was his firstborn and would have been, according to chapter 3 of this book, the rightful heir to the throne. So he was his firstborn. He was his older boy, but it was with a different mother. Ammon, however, already displays the sins of his father, as is often the case. He is consumed with his lust, wants to fulfill it with his half-sister at any cost. We read he was physically, emotionally sick, that he couldn't have her. He would sacrifice this throne if need be. But here's the depths of sin that it can drag you down. How foolish is this? For a woman that really you should have no interest in. and certainly never entertain a thought. Even the Bible would not have allowed this kind of marriage to take place at all. We read in verse 3 that Ammon had a friend. His name was Jonadab. He was the brother of Shemaiah, David's brother. Now, Jonadab was a very crafty man. Not a good thing to have friends that are crafty. And he said to him, "Why are you, the king's son, becoming thinner every day? Will you not tell me?" And Ammon said, "I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." And Jonadab said to him, "Well, then lie down on your bed, pretend to be ill. When your father comes to see you, just say to him, 'Could you just let Tamar come and give me some food and prepare it in my sight, that I might see it and eat it from her hand?'" And so Amnon took his advice, went home, pretended to be ill. When the king asked about him, he said, "Could you let Tamar, my sister, come and make a couple of cakes for me in my sight, I might eat them?" And David sent to Tamar and said, "No, go to your brother Ammon's house and prepare some food for him." He had a friend. Well, actually, it was his cousin, sneaky, crafty. Hearing of Ammon's desire, he doesn't really rebuke him like he should. Not really a good friend. Rather, he suggests a way to scheme to get her on her own. Pretty sad house when these plots are being made. Notice in verse 4 that Ammon calls his lust love. It's not the first time or the last time that word is misused. Ammon did what he was told, and David fell for it, and there we go. So Tamar went to her brother Ammon's house, verse 8. He was lying down. She needed some cakes or some flour, needed it, made cakes in his sight, baked them. She took the pan and placed them out before him, and he refused to eat. And Ammon says, "Have everyone go from me," and they all went from him. And Ammon said, "Could you bring the food into the bedroom? Might eat from your hand." And so Tamar took the cakes which had been made, brought them to Ammon, her brother, in the bedroom. And when she had brought them to him to eat, he grabbed her by the hand. He said, "Can you come and lie with me, my sister?" She answered him, saying, "No, my brother, do not force me, for such things should not be done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing. And where would I take my shame? As for you, you'd be like one of the fools in Israel. Please speak to the king. He will not withhold me from you. However, he would not heed her voice. He was stronger than her, and he forced her and lay with her." Ammon first sought to attract Tamar's attention with a lurid invitation. Just came right out and said it. She was horrified. She was not in a position to argue much in her position as a woman in the culture. She tried to reason with him, asked him to be wise, not just emotional, pointed out it would ruin her life, it would certainly ruin his. Where could she hide her shame? He'll lose the throne. She even offered to marry him. I'm sure Dad wouldn't keep me from you if that's what we both wanted, even though the law of God forbid half-sisters being married. She thought David would say that was all right. Ammon instead won't take no for an answer. He's pretty excited now that she's there, and so he just takes her and he rapes her. Ammon's deaf response to all of her pleas shows the hatred and the violence that is pretty hard to equivocate. See a lot of it today as well. But, you put Jeremiah 17, verse 9 in the margin. The heart is deceitful and desperately wicked. And, sir, here's a young man that is absolutely all of those things. And he has his way with her. Tamar was defenseless. She was violated. She was shamed. And she was scarred. But look at the deceitfulness of our flesh and how flesh can be destroyed through lust. We often hear people say, well, let's make love. Especially when it's two people fulfilling their fleshly desires like animals in heat. It's instinctive, it's self-serving, it's immoral. There's no love there. Mislabeled, for sure. Selfish Ammon, when this was all over with, verse 15, looked at her and hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred he had for her, greater than the love he had for her. And Ammon said to her, "Arise and be gone." She said, "No, indeed. This evil of sending me away is worse than the other that you just did to me," by how he wouldn't listen to her. And he called his servant, attended him, and said, "Here, put this woman out away from me, bolt the door behind her." And so she took off. She had on a robe of many colors, for the king's virgin daughters had worn those apparels, and her servant put her out and bolted the door. And Tamar put ashes on her head, tore the robe of many colors that she had on, laid her hand on her head, and went away and wept bitterly. Ammon, selfishly taking what he wanted rather than being satisfied, is now nauseated with his own sin, turning himself into the victim, because sin doesn't satisfy. And may I say to you, if you are young and you are dating, and if that boy that you're dating says, "If you love me, you'll sleep with me," turn that loser in now and find a godly man. If you don't know of any, call me. I'll do interviews with you. As long as we can get rid of the creep, the sooner the better. So she goes home. She cries. She says to this boy, "This is worse off than raping me. You're kicking me out of the house." And she tears her virgin robe, which she had proudly worn. She goes home. Well, at home, her real brother, Absalom, is there. And he says, and Absalom, her brother, says to her, "Has Ammon, my brother, been with you? Well, hold your peace, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this thing to heart." So Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house. But when King David heard about all these things, he was very angry. And Absalom spoke to his brother Ammon, neither for good or bad, but Absalom hated him because he had forced his daughter or sister Tamar. Her brother quickly figured out what was going on. I guess this fella Ammon had not a very good reputation. She admits to what happened. He asks that she keep it to herself, which is not good to do, and stay at home with him until he can work it out. David, notice his response was anger. All right, what are you going to do about it? And the answer is David did nothing about it. Why did David do nothing about it? Because David was guilty also. And it is hard to point your finger at someone else when there's three pointing back at you. He is in a difficult place to say anything. So, even though the scriptures are very clear there in Leviticus chapter 20, that if a man takes his sister, his father's daughter or his mother's daughter, sees her nakedness and takes her for himself, he shall be cut off, he'll be put to death. This was a murderous offense, capital punishment case in God's eyes. Why was David silent? Well, like I said, his own sin no doubt put him in limbo, and then he's very lax. Oh, it'll all work out. I got 20 homes to deal with. And he does absolutely nothing, which turns out to be a pretty big problem. Now, Solomon, David's son, who followed in much of his father's footsteps, when it came to lust in women, at least in the times he was away from the Lord, was a man that when he asked God for a gift and God said, "What do you want?" He said, "I want to be wiser than everybody that ever lived." And the Lord said, "You got it. And with it, I'll give you power as well." When Solomon was walking with God, he would write much about parental discipline, about spiritual leadership, about purity and holiness. You can, if you spare the rod, you're going to spoil your son. If you love him, you're going to discipline him properly. Foolishness is in the heart of this child. A rod of correction will drive it far from him. He had us a lot of advice about, stay close to your kids. Don't let them just run away and get away with it. And unfortunately, too many kids today are being left alone by their parents. When Adoniah, who is another one of David's sons and Absalom's younger brother, same family, would seek later on to overthrow his father. And we won't get to that until chapter 1 of 1 Kings, I think. When we read there of what had possessed this young man to go after his father's throne, you read his father had never rebuked him at any time or asked him what he was doing. He was a good-looking man. He was the second born to his mother after Absalom. Good-looking kid, had a lot of things going on, but Dad, David, never once asked him what he was up to. So that gives you a pretty good idea of the father who's not involved. We read in verse 23, and it came to pass after 2 full years. Oh man, that's a long time to be angry. That Absalom had a sheep shearers in Baal, Hazor, which is near Ephraim. And Absalom invited all of the king's sons, all of the boys from all of the different families. When Absalom came to the king and said, kindly note your servants have sheep shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant. And the king said to Absalom, no, my son. Let us not all go now. That'll be a burden to you. And he urged him, but he said no, and he blessed him. And Absalom said, well, if you're not going to go, at least let my brother Ammon come as well. And the king said, why should he go with you? But Absalom encouraged him, and he finally relented and told Ammon he should go to this party, the celebration of the sheep being, multiplying and the wool being taken and all. It was payday, right? It was harvest time. Absalom, who had a pagan mother, hated his father for not doing anything about this whole rape. Hated his brother Ammon, certainly. Seethed for 2 years. I don't know how I'm going to get even, but I'm going to do it somehow. Revenge was on his mind. And I think David was a little bit aware of it. David goes, well, we don't want to all burden you, but I think David didn't want everybody over there. He knew there was a lot of friction. Finally talked him into just letting Ammon come. And I think David was very uneasy. Maybe David thought, because this is narrative, so we have to kind of put ourselves in the picture. Maybe David thought, finally they're going to be reconciled. There's going to be some peace in the family. Maybe that's what he hoped for. Additionally, Absalom was the third in line to the throne. If Ammon died, Absalom would move up to number 2. There was another kid named Chileab, who you can't find in the Bible. He shows up in birth, and then we don't know what happened to him. It could be he was gone too, so the Absalom doing arithmetic, 3, 2, 1, I could move up anyway. Bible gives us no clue. So I don't know what the motive, we know the motive for Absalom was murder. And then maybe politics. And Dad, I guess, hoped for the best, probably thought this wasn't going to be or go so well. We read in verse 28 that Absalom had commanded his servants, saying, I want you to watch. And when Ammon's heart is merry with wine, when I say to you, strike Ammon, then kill him. Don't be afraid. Have I not commanded you? So you be courageous and valiant. And so the servants of Absalom did to Ammon as he had commanded. And all of the king's sons, they got onto their mules and fled. Nobody hanging around to fight together. This family did not get along. Nobody stood with each other whatsoever. Premeditated murder was the result of David having let it go unresolved for so long. The servants of Absalom had courage enough to disagree. If they disagreed, they didn't do anything about it. And David's other sons, they all ran to protect themselves. Verse 30, and it came to pass while they were on the way that news came to David. But the news had already kind of gotten out of whack, as news will go. Absalom has killed all of the king's sons. Not one of them is left. Oh man, David went home and tore his garments and lay on the ground. His servants stood by them with their clothes torn. And then Jonadab, remember he's the guy that said to Ammon, hey, just have her come over and cook for you. David's brother, son of David's brother, answered and said to David, let not my lord suppose they've all been killed, the king's sons. Only Ammon is dead. For by the commandment of Absalom, this has been determined from the day that he forced his sister Tamar. Therefore, let not my lord the king take this thing to heart, to think that all of your children are dead, only Ammon is dead. So the exaggerated reports are cleaned up by the guy who really instigated the thing to begin with. And it had gone on for 2 years. He'd been planning this for 2 years. That's what his friend said. From the day you did nothing, this has been on his mind. Well, then we are told in verse 34 that Absalom, after this, fled. The young man who was watching the field looked up in his eyes and looked, and there were many people coming down the road on the hillside behind him, and Jehonadab said to the king, look, the king's sons are coming, as your servant just told you. And so it was, as soon as he had finished speaking, that the sons came. They lifted up their voice and wept, and the king and the servants, they wept bitterly. But Absalom, he fled, and he went to Tamar, to the king of Geshur, and David mourned for his son every day. Absalom fled, he went to Geshur. He was there for 3 years, while David longed to go to Absalom, but he had been comforted concerning Amnon because he was dead. So Absalom flees to Syria. Syria is where his mom was from, where he could go hide, if you will. He would stay there for 3 years. Nothing David could do to bring him back. He was hiding. David, apparently from verse 38, was torn with emotion. He didn't know what to do, verse 39. Some days he wanted to see him, other days he wanted to kill him. We read in verse 39 that used to David the word longed. And then in verse 1 of chapter 14, you read the word concerned. They are both passive. In other words, David, he was up one day, now down the next. I want to kill him, I want to forgive him. I want to love him, I want him dead. As maybe you can relate to. So David was hurting and grieving and living with the consequences of years of inaction, parental misuse of the word love for his kids. He hasn't really done anything. All driving back to this whole thing with Bathsheba because, well, at least in part, he couldn't say anything. So I think if you stay involved with your kids, you're probably better off making an enemy of them from time to time rather than trying to make a friend all the time in the hopes that you'll save what you probably will lose in the long run. David, 2 years did nothing. Son gets killed. It's actually a biblical thing, I mean, it would have been if the priest would have been involved, this probably would have happened. And then 3 years of Absalom being away, 5 years pass. David is now in his mid-50s, if you will. Chapter 14, verse 1. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, then perceived that the king's heart was concerned about Absalom. Now you remember Joab. Joab was not a godly man. He was one of the 3 kids of his sister, David's sister. He was sometimes in charge of the army. Other times he was put down because he didn't obey his orders, if you will. But he'd been the guy that had led the children of Israel into Jerusalem over the Jebusites. Anyway, he's a tough guy. He noticed that David wanted to make things right, and so he thought, well, I'll get involved. No matter who wins here, David or Absalom, at least I'll be looking pretty. I tried to be matchmaker, right, and peacemaker. So he wanted to meddle to his own benefit, if you will, a king and his son. I'm in no matter what happens. And so Joab sent to Tekoa, and he brought from there a wise woman. And he said to her, please pretend to be a mourner. Sounds like deception to me. Put a mourning apparel on. Don't anoint yourself with oil. Just act like a woman who's been mourning a long time for the dead. And then go and tell the king and speak after this manner. And Joab put some words in her mouth. This is what we want you to say. And so the woman from Tekoa went to the king. She fell on her face on the ground, prostrated herself, said, help me, O king. What troubles you, he asked. Indeed, I am a widow and my husband is dead. Your maidservant has 2 sons, and the 2 have been fighting with one another in the field. There was no one there to part them, and one struck the other and killed him. The whole family has risen up against me. They've said, deliver him who struck his brother, that we may execute him for the life of his brother whom he killed, and we'll destroy the heir also. And so they would extinguish my ember that is left and leave my husband neither name nor remnant of the earth, as my only living son. The king said, go home, I will give orders concerning this very thing. And so the woman of Tekoa said to the king, my lord, O king, let the iniquity be on me and upon my father's house, and the king and his throne be guiltless. She couldn't go through with it. And the king said, whoever says anything to you, bring him to me, and he shall not touch you anymore. And she says, please let the king remember the Lord your God, and do not permit the avenger of blood to destroy any more, lest they destroy my son. And David said, as the Lord lives, not a hair of your sons will fall to the ground. And so the woman then said to them, please let your maidservant speak another word to my lord. And he said, okay. And she said, why then have you schemed such a thing against the people of God? For the king speaks this as one who is guilty, and that the king does not bring his banished home again. For we will surely die, become like water spilled on the ground, which can't be gathered up. Yet God does not take away a life, but he devises some so that his banished ones are not expelled from him. Therefore, I came to ask of this thing of my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid. And your servant said, I will now speak to the king, and maybe that the king will perform the request for your maidservant. For the king will hear and deliver his maidservant from the hand of the man who would destroy me and my son together with the inheritance of God. Your maidservant said, the word of my lord the king will now be comforting, as the angel of God. So is my lord the king in discerning good and evil, and may the Lord your God be with you. And David, catching on to this now, says to the woman, please don't hide anything from me that I asked you. She said, please ask. Did Joab put you up to this, basically? And the woman said, as you live, my lord the king, no one can turn to the right or to the left from anything that my lord the king has spoken. Your servant Joab commanded me. He's put all these words in my mouth and in the mouth of your servant to bring about this change of affairs. Your servant Joab has done this thing, but my Lord is wise, according to the wisdom of the angel of the Lord, to know everything that is upon the earth. So, interesting to me that Joab would find a woman who's good at words. By the way, the word wise here means cunning in verse 2, or shrewd, if you will. And she's a pretty good actress. She gets David to sign on protecting her one last son. The other one had been killed and all. And she finally says, kind of like you want to do justice for me, but you're not bringing justice to your own family. David, not being a dumb guy, said, did you get put up to this? And she goes, yeah, I did. But I want you to notice in verse 10 down through verse 17, I know we read it fairly quickly, that David's emotional outlook in all of this is that you see his kindness, you see his justice. All of his emotions had been running wild for years. The woman even says to David, I know you know what's right and wrong, so do the right thing. Come on, you can make this right. We read in verse 18 and 19 and 20 as David sees it that he understands what they're trying to do, and he's not angry. He's not sure he can pull this off. Verse 18, then the king answered and he said to the woman, please do not hide from me anything that I ask you. And so she told him. Verse 21, and the king said to Joab, all right, I've granted this thing. Go, therefore, bring back the young man Absalom. All right, let's get this over with. Joab fell to the ground on his face, bowed himself, thanked the king, and said, today your servant knows that I have found grace in your sight, my lord, O king, that the king has fulfilled the request of his servant. And so Joab arose and he went down to Syria, bringing Absalom back to Jerusalem. But when he got there, the king says, let him go to his own house. Don't bring him to see my face. And so Absalom is back in the country, but he is now left separated from his fathers still. We will read down in verse 28 that this will last 2 more years. 2 years for the rape to be resolved, 3 years after the murder, isolated, 2 years coming back home to me with his father. Still nothing has been resolved, if you will. David can't get over it. He's seething in his anger. He refuses to see his son. The conflict is not good. It's raging. We read in verse 25, now it happened there in all of Israel. Now in all of Israel there was no one who was praised as much as Absalom for his good looks. From the sole of his feet to the crown of his head, no blemish on him. Excuse me. When he cut the hair of his head at the end of every year, he cut it because it was heavy upon him, and when he cut it, he weighed the hair. It weighed 200 shekels according to the king's standard. So it weighed 5 pounds. Long-haired dude. And Absalom was born, to Absalom were born 3 sons, 1 daughter, and he named her Tamar after his sister. She was a beautiful woman of appearance. And Absalom stayed for 2 years in Jerusalem, didn't see the face of his father. So here's the picture, and we're going to get it in the next chapter. Absalom comes home, and dad doesn't want to talk to him. Absalom gets involved in the community, has sons and daughter. Excuse me. It's been 7 years now. 2 years, 3 years, 2 years since this has been dealt with. It has been gone on way too long. So, finally, verse 29. Almost made it. Absalom had had enough. We read there that he sent for Joab, said, I want to see my dad. He wouldn't come see me. Sent for him a second time to talk to Joab, who wouldn't show up. He didn't want to deal with this. It was no longer a benefit to Joab, I think. So he sent his servants into Joab's field that was near his, and he said to them, go set his field on fire. That seemed to get his attention. And so, verse 31, Joab arose and he came to Absalom's home. He said to him, why have you set my field on fire? And Absalom said, look, I sent for you. Come see me. I want to see the king. Why have you brought me back from Syria? It'd been better for me to just still be there. I have family there. Now let me see the king's face. If there's iniquity in me, then let him execute me. But we're going to not let this go. And so Joab went to the king, forced the issue. He called for Absalom. He bowed on his face to the ground. The king kissed his son's cheek. On the surface, it all looked better, but in reality, this had been going on way too long, and now it was well too late. We won't get to chapter 15 tonight, but don't forget what we just read, because in the next chapter, the motivation for what Absalom is about to do is found in these 7 years. And his plan was, everyone likes me. I think I could get enough people together to vote for me and just get my dad kicked out of office altogether. He's a hard-hearted, old, kind of grouchy man who's done a lot of wrong things. He wouldn't deal with my sister's, rape. Should have, but he didn't. So I have great motivation to see him removed from office. The years had left both with little ability to love each other. There was no forgiveness on either side, lack of responsibility, and now a father had lost his son for good. Very different than Joseph, who softened with his heart before the Lord when he met his brothers who had sold him into slavery, loved them truly, told them he would take care of them, that he realized what they had planned to do against him. God would use it for good. God sent me to preserve your life. And when he saw his brother, he could barely stay away from hugging them, kissing them, grabbing them. He loved them even though they had persecuted him But this is different. No one's getting along here at all. So here's some consequences of sin laid open. No forgiveness, no mercy, no parenting, no right, no leadership. All in a man's heart who loves the Lord, God greatly used. It's the problem for Christians, not just for the world. If you go back to chapter 14 here, verse 4, and we'll kind of end with this, since my voice is ending anyway. The woman said to David, as she began to speak to him, "Help me, O king." And she laid out all of the things that she was concerned about. And then, I'm sorry, verse 14, I don't mean verse 4. She said to him, "We're all going to die. One day we're going to be spilled out like water on the ground. We can't be gathered back into the cup." Her point was, if bitterness and pride continue one day, death will eliminate any chance of resolution. So don't let it go this long. Don't let it take so long. The death in this relationship happened in the heart long before in the body. You see it in families all the time. We unfortunately have families come in sometimes who are having financial trouble and they go, "Could the church help us?" So where's your family? "Oh, we don't get along." Well, great. Now you're in trouble. Maybe this is the time to fix it because you need some help. "Oh, I don't want to help fix. We want you to be our family." "I can't do that. Go talk to your parents. Go talk to your brother, your sister." So, done a lot of funerals over the years and see people gather around caskets at funerals unable to resolve their conflicts in peace. So says this woman to David, "Resolve this now, because Absalom will not be able to respond later. And he's not going to be able to read the nice flowery things you're going to say at his funeral." I always thought it was an interesting custom that we send flowers to funerals to honor the dead. And I usually say at funerals, you that sent flowers, send them to somebody you love before they die. They'll appreciate them more. Nobody ever takes me up on it. David was angry with Absalom, but David's sins were certainly as grave. He had tried for years to hide it. Wasn't good. Absalom was waiting for his dad to do the right thing, and his dad didn't do it. David, God forgave you. How about you forgive your son? You're obligated to forgive. And we don't do that so readily with some, and we'll, do it with others. But God's not a respecter of persons at all. So we read here in verse 14, God will devise the means. And I love that. She says, we're all going to die. God's no respecter of persons. God will devise a way where you can fix these kind of things. For us, Adam and Eve were banished from the garden. Their intimate relationship with God was broken by sin. But they left with a promise from God that God would fix it. He would devise a means. The gospel certainly turns out to be the means, right? The plan that God has. He would send his only begotten Son. He would take our guilt and shame. God would lay upon him the sins of the world. He would pay for our transgressions, and we could live with him. God's whole nature is restorative, it's regenerative, it's redemptive. Unfortunately, David will not follow through. This is not getting better, this is getting worse. In fact, in the next chapter or two, this son of his is going to be dead. It's going to be dead. Killed by Joab. Killed by the very guy that he trusts in. It doesn't get better, it gets worse. So, die to yourself, make peace, usually a better way to go. Because God has provided a way for you to get back. You can provide it for others, right? It's a very somber chapter. I'm sorry that I didn't have a lot of jokes tonight, but how do you laugh at this? Maybe next week. Father, thank you tonight for your word to us, how important it is that we take to heart a couple of things, that we love our wives, and we're exclusive in our relationship with our wives in our homes, that there's a great consequence to roaming eyes and idle hands and playing on the margins and on the edges of life. And even if we get away with it, look what we pay as a result. Look what David went through to have what was certainly not worth a quick relationship with a woman that he saw across the way. I think had he had it to do over again and seeing all that came from it, he'd have ran in the house and locked the door. But God warns us so that we might take it to heart. Look, sin isn't good for us. It's going to hurt us. It's going to destroy. It's going to separate. There's no reward for sin except judgment. Now, we're not going to leave David in this horrible position where he's suffering so much, because at the end of these things, David is going to find himself back in a relationship with the Lord that we're going to honor and be moved by. But he also has to suffer the consequences, and so do we. Push people away enough, and pretty soon they don't want to talk to you. And whatever influence you might have had, you won't have anymore. God will, and wants to do greater things than that. And it goes back to God will provide a means. He's saved us. He's forgiven us. What should we now do with his mercy? But extend it to those who don't deserve it like we don't deserve it. And do it as quickly as you can. Every day spent waiting is a day spent agonizing. Give it a shot. See what the Lord will do. Well worth it. But we can draw all this back to the sin with David to begin with. This was not a good place for David to start. This was all precipitated by some bad decisions on a roof that a 50-year-old man made in the prime of his life with God's great blessings. And these 7 years that we just read about, all this happened in a 7-year period. Brings David to 57, 58 years old. God help us. May his word soften your heart. And may you be a peacemaker, because that's what God would be with you. If you need to have peace with God tonight, the pastors will be up front. We'd love to pray with you. There's a way to find peace with God. There's a way to have our sins forgiven. There's a way to have our name written in the book of life. God will provide that through his Son. We'll show you in the Bible that that's so. So come tonight. Before you go home, come up here to the stage, to the front, talk to one of the boys, and let the Lord just minister to you his love and his mercy and forgiveness. And then take that and give that to somebody else. Shall we stand?